Hi, welcome to Jus Cogens, the International Law Podcast. This is a special crossover episode with the great folks at Borderline Jurisprudence, which is a brand new international law podcast on the market. And we are joined by Başak Etkin and Kostia Gorobets, who are the hosts of this wonderful initiative. We'll talk a bit about the podcast, but first, I would have introduced the guest myself. And I won't do that not because I haven't Googled them, but because despite living a year in the Netherlands and taking a beginner French course, I can't pronounce the names of the universities where they're working. So I'll let them do the talking on that front. So let's start with Başak, and then Kostia, just briefly tell a bit about yourself.
Okay, thank you, Omar, for having us. My name is Başak Etkin. I'm a PhD candidate at Université Paris 2 Panthéon-Assas. And yeah, I'm the co-host of Borderline Jurisprudence.
I am Kostia Gorobets. I'm also a PhD student and a lecturer at University of Groningen. I have no idea if I pronounce it correctly because Dutch is rough and tough. I'm also a co-host of Borderline Jurisprudence, and thank you very much for having us. It's great to be here.
Great. So how come two very serious, academics like you thought of starting this podcast, all of a sudden? What's the big idea about Borderline Jurisprudence? Perhaps Başak, you can go first, and then Kostia, you can add in.
First of all, serious? Have you seen our Twitter feeds? I'm not sure how serious.
Well, the work that you do is serious.
We are. Yeah. Well, this is all Kostia's fault, so I think he should go first.
Well, yeah, I could. Yeah, because I initiated this, so I came up with the idea. But I mean, the explanation is really simple. Of course, that we had organized together also with Nicolas Carrillo the webinar on international law and positivism in February, and we received such an amazing response, and we never actually anticipated that the webinar would be so popular. At the initial stage, we were thinking maybe 100 people would register at the top. At the end of the day, we had 600 registered participants, and I think at the peak we had 300 plus listeners. So that was just completely mind-blowing, and that actually evidenced that philosophy of international law and jurisprudence of international law is something that is of interest for people. So that's something that people want to discuss. That's something that people want to learn more about. And so just at some point I just wrote Başak, hey, should we do a podcast on that, just to continue on that success?
And obviously at first I said, no, what are you thinking? But then I came around 15 minutes later, to be precise. And I said, let's give it a try, I guess. I think we both have really packed up schedules already, but this is a way for us also to learn as we go along.
Right.
So that's what got to me, I guess.
What I'm wondering is why philosophy and jurisprudence in particular? Is it aligned with the research that you're doing for your PhDs? Is that the reason?
Yeah, totally.
Same for me.
I think Kostia is more the jurisprudence and philosophy side of it, and I'm more the international law side of it. So he knows more jurisprudence than me, way more. And I'd like to think maybe I know a little bit more international law than him. So we kind of complete each other.
Okay.
He will admit to this. This is not coming from me.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. Yeah, I have a jurisprudence background, and I specialized in it, even though my dissertation is on philosophy of international law. I'm learning from Başak on international law, obviously, but I wouldn't underestimate Başak's understanding and knowledge in jurisprudence, to be honest. That's really something that you shouldn't
I'm glad
be
to hear that.
too humble about,
No, but obviously, when I said I didn't mean to underestimate your understanding of international law,
Of course.
But it's our backgrounds are different, but we come together in this middle point, which is jurisprudence of international law, and that's what that's our research area, and it's so niche that difficult to come along. People who work on this I think it's a growing group, but it's difficult to come along.
All right. So the name Borderline Jurisprudence, how did that come about? I know the answer to that because I've listened to the first episode, but for our listeners and our viewers, I'd like to know anyway. Başak, perhaps.
Yeah, Başak, go first because I think you came up with this name.
I think you came up with this.
Right. Good coordination.
Did I?
Yeah. So we were both coming up with names, brainstorming, messages flying around. And I don't know how it came to be, but you said borderline. Kostia said borderline, and borderline as in HLA Hart's view of international law being a borderline case of law. So Kostia came up with this idea of borderline, and which is a brilliant idea for this jurisprudence, for this podcast, because it's exactly what we're talking about, this neglected area that has been deemed borderline, not only by Hart, but also by others. So yeah, that's the story.
Yeah, I think we initially we had a little different ideas about the name. I think the original name that we had was like talks at the borderline, something like that, so that we talk with people at this borderline. But then I think this final name actually came out when Başak was creating a mail account for it. And it actually said, Borderline Jurisprudence. And I was like, why don't we just use it as the name for the podcast, Borderline Jurisprudence? It sounds so nice.
And I'm guessing it was available on Google.
Of course.
So I'll just put you on the spot. Do you agree with Hart's understanding, Başak?
No.
Why not?
Don't, right?
No, is it a borderline case of law? International law?
It's not a borderline case of law, but it's a borderline case of jurisprudence in the sense that it has been neglected. In
what way?
Maybe. As Hart does, counting it a borderline case of law made it a borderline case of jurisprudence, because then nobody worked on it, basically.
Right. Costa?
I don't
know. Well, I'm more flexible in that, because I think that it really depends on what you think a borderline case is and what the central case is. So in some ways, international law is a borderline case. In some, it is not. I think that Hart had a point a bit. He wasn't too articulate about it, maybe, as he could have been. But yeah, I don't think it is. I fully agree with Başak that we may, of course, discuss these ontological issues of whether it is or is not a borderline case of law, and if yes, in what exact sense. But jurisprudentially speaking, it is true that international law very rarely informed the way we think about law generally. So in jurisprudence, so very rarely people in jurisprudence seriously engage with international law to see whether their theories work there. So in that sense, totally, it is a borderline case of jurisprudence.
Right.
I agree with Başak.
So given that the podcast is an intersection of both philosophy and jurisprudence of international law, and do you think there's been enough theorizing and work done on the philosophy and jurisprudence of international law? And if there isn't, then, how do you think this conversation that you're planning to, start with this initiative, how is that going to address that gap in theorizing and that gap in general in literature?
Yeah, well, I think, so this is a very complex question. Well, first of all, like philosophy and jurisprudence of international law is now getting more popular, I think, than it used to be like maybe 10, 20 years ago. But there are kind of different aspects to that, right? Because this is an area of research that appears at the overlap of international law and jurisprudence, obviously. So it can be worked out from either way, right? So it can be that jurisprudence people work with international law, and it can be that international law people work with jurisprudence. So this latter case is more popular, of course. So international lawyers, they try to engage with jurisprudence, and they've always tried. It's just that I feel that they rarely get some answer from jurisprudence in a way. Yeah, so jurisprudence didn't really engage with international law as much as it could. So that's what I said earlier. And yeah, so I think that's the idea of the podcast, to sort of take that area and try to approach it from both sides. So talk to international law minded people who work in jurisprudence, and jurisprudence minded people who work in international law, and yeah, try to kind of see what kind of conversation we can have there.
Right. So, Başak, do you think that contemporary international law theory and the modern sources of international law, do they engage with jurisprudence or philosophy directly or indirectly? And has there been a movement to talk about these things more in the modern framework of international law?
As I entered this area, it's been less than a year, so I'm practically brand new. And this has been his research for longer than that. So since I've came along, I'd like to say yes, because I think so jurisprudence in the very strict sense is so, yeah, again, this word niche. Not many people engage with this. So international lawyers, I think, are not discovering, but taking up this challenge of tackling this black box of jurisprudence. And from what I have seen in this period that's less than a year, I think there's a growing momentum if we were to open up our minds a bit and see jurisprudence in a larger sense. It's everywhere. So I think the question is not so much, are they engaging with jurisprudence, but it's more, this will sound philosophical, but what is jurisprudence?
What is jurisprudence?
I don't have the answer, but it's a lot of things. There are people who are doing completely different things from each other, and it can all be under the umbrella of jurisprudence. And I think maybe, I hope, with our episodes, we will show this umbrella. There will be people from, again, I hope, there will be people from such diverse backgrounds that you wouldn't expect, but it will all come together under this topic of jurisprudence.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Başak said. I really think that there is this momentum indeed from the international law side to engage with jurisprudence more and more. And the interesting thing is that because jurisprudence didn't really engage with international law as much as it could have, that created a very interesting situation when international legal theory sort of evolutionized on its own, right? Without really being incorporated in some larger scheme of thinking about the law. Yeah, so it was kind of it wasn't supported from the jurisprudence side. And this is an interesting thing, because these theoretizations and conceptualizations that we have in international legal theory, they are rather detached from the things that are being discussed or are being written about in jurisprudence. So that is an interesting phenomenon in itself, and that is also a kind of a topic that we would like to address, I think. Is, for instance, that's also a topic that we discussed a little at our webinar. Why did we call it international in positivism? Because, well, it's interesting how different ideas we use when we speak of international legal positivism and legal positivism in jurisprudence. Right. At some points, they are even incompatible, which is a strange phenomenon in itself. So I think that was another reason why we actually initiated this podcast, to sort of try to figure out how that happened and what can we do about it.
Right. So now that you have come out with the first episode, congratulations on that. It was a
Thank
fantastic
you.
listen.
Thanks.
Absolutely enjoyed it. How do you see this podcast going forward? I know it's too early to say anything because you've just started, but in terms of just having conversations on these areas, which, as Kostya said, they have not been explored enough, and there are a lot of gaps which need to be bridged, between jurisprudence and contemporary international law theory. So going forward, uh, what do you think this podcast is going to do or try to do to address these issues?
I think this comes back a bit to my earlier answer. I think the idea, I mean, maybe Kostya will disagree, but my idea is to show a range of things, because I think lawyers are across all borders, private law, public law, whatever. We're all very focused on what we do, and we don't explore a lot. So I think this might be an opportunity to show people what else is out there, basically, because that's something we need, obviously.
Right.
More dialogue. I think that's what I hope it will be.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because, well, the variety, the idea of kind of tackling different perspectives is obviously something that we want to have in our podcast, and I hope we will manage to do that, because like Başak said earlier, what is jurisprudence really? This term can mean different things in different cultures, and we don't really want the podcast only be on like jurisprudence in the Anglo-American sense of the word, like this very, well, not really dry, but this a little detached analytical kind of approach to concepts and phenomena. So we will try to also have some critical legal studies scholars, some scholars who do more of an empirical oriented research, some who do more of a history of international law, or history of ideas about international law that can help reveal this different aspects of the concept or phenomenon of international law that we discussed. So that is probably the plan. So we try to sort of create a lineup of the episodes so that each episode somehow offers something else, something different, maybe even competing. I don't know. That can also be the case. I mean, I already want to spoil the next episodes, but I won't.
Given it's a hardcore philosophy and jurisprudence podcast, are you also planning to engage perhaps practitioners or people who have a non-academic background just to reflect their understanding of jurisprudence and philosophy of international law?
I think we will, hopefully, and I think we have a name to make this connection that will go from theory to practice. Like, how do we reconcile these two things? As David Lefkowitz said in the first episode, he said, I'm interested in justice, but I'm very detached from how it's being applied, how it's happening. So we have stuff coming up.
Right. So why did you guys choose podcast as a platform? Were you like into podcasts before?
Well, not really. That's interesting. So I'm not really a podcast person, and I never really was. I think that the only podcast that I listen regularly is Philosophy Bites, which I greatly enjoy. And I think that has been perhaps a model for our podcast as well, in terms of how we approach it, how we build it. So this kind of variety of perspectives and variety of topics. But of course, Philosophy Bites is a general philosophical podcast, right? So they don't specialize in a particular area. And in this sense, our podcast is, of course, very niche, as Başak said, because it's not only international law is a niche thing. jurisprudence is also a niche thing, and their combination is even more of a niche. So yeah, that's really narrow, which is surprising that it's now kind of being so talked about on Twitter primarily.
I am a podcast person, but it was more of a leisure. I never listened to news on podcasts or anything law related. It's I listen to sciencey things too. Like it's completely leisure. So I guess I was into podcasts, but not this, not in this.
Are you saying you didn't listen to Scott Shapiro's jurisprudence podcast? You wouldn't like that.
I have not finished it though. I did listen to it, but I have. And also Jus Cogens, obviously.
Of course,
yes, of course.
And I haven't paid these guys, or told them to plug this. How was the first response of the first episode? Were you guys expecting the sort of overwhelming feedback that you guys received?
We were hoping. We were hopeful. We were wondering what success would look like in podcasting, and as we had no idea, we said maybe 100 listens in the first week could be deemed successful, and we have passed that mark. What did you say, Kostia, that we were at?
Yeah, let me just check it live. I think
Taking out the analytics like a professional podcaster.
Yeah, it's 155 now in 3 days.
Yeah,
that's very impressive.
So we're happy.
Yeah, we are happy, and we are of course very happy with our first guest, because Professor Lefkowitz was very, very interesting and very sharp, and gave such amazingly engaging answers that I think it was a very good choice of a first guest. So we were lucky in that as well.
Right. And how frequently are you planning to do these episodes?
Well, bi-weekly, that's the idea for now. But we may diverge from that if that's necessary. But so far we don't really want to rush too much and kind of make episodes every week. And at the same time, we don't want to kind of do it without any schedule, like some podcasts do, like whenever they have a new material. So we want to schedule things, but do not kind of make the schedule too tight for us.
Yeah, I think it's you can get very over ambitious if you get very good response and over plan. At least I have suffered that. Doing a lot of episodes and then having a burnout and taking 5 months off because just couldn't deal with just coordinating with people in different time zones and stuff like that. So what is the particular target audience that you want to address through this podcast?
Geeks. International law geeks who are interested in jurisprudence, and jurisprudence geeks who are interested in international law.
Right, because it's a fairly technical podcast in terms of that addresses a particular niche of people who are interested in hardcore issues of philosophy and jurisprudence. So Kostia, do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's our audience. I mean, of course, that doesn't really mean that we do not want other people to listen to it, because I think it can be of interest for people who do just general international, public international law, or human rights law, or any other area of international law. Because, the good thing about doing philosophy, I know that from my personal experience, is that when you do philosophy, you're interested in everything, right? Because you can see something in any topic out there. And that has kind of the opposite effect, right? So when you're doing philosophy, you can say something about any area. Yeah, at least you may have at least some insight into that. So I think that is also a good thing for the podcast, because I think it can in principle be of interest for people doing just general international law, or just generally doing jurisprudence, never really touching on international law as such. And and also for students, obviously for students of international law, students in jurisprudence and legal philosophy. Yeah, I will obviously include it in my syllabus.
Right. And in terms of dissemination, as I'm sure you guys must have seen, Twitter is a very powerful platform for engaging in meaningful conversations. Especially, there's this whole, I wouldn't call it a cult, but a niche of international law enthusiasts on Twitter who know each other, and they're posting memes. The meme game of international lawyers is very strong. There are a lot of different pages coming up who specialize in international law memes. Uh, so how do you see Twitter as a platform for having conversations and discussing ideas relating to your podcast and generally relating to international law? How's your experience been like in terms of networking and making connections, holding webinars?
I have to this will be my love letter to Twitter, I guess.
Please take your time.
Because that's how I met Kostia. And this has been one of the most engaging and challenging professional relationships. It has been the most challenging relationship of my career. It has been, Twitter brought me Kostia, and I have found my co-host. It's been because I joined Twitter less than a year ago.
Really?
Precisely when I became interested in this area, and I found this ocean.
By ocean, are you referring to Adil Haq's retweets?
I'm referring to this really cool, nice group of people who are spending too much time on social media, but who are also really kind and interesting and clever, and professors who don't mind speaking to PhD candidates as if they were equals, and a lot of early career researchers who have this little. I made so many friends. Twitter has been truly a blessing.
Did it help in organizing your webinar, Başak?
It has been. I think it was born out of discussions on Twitter. It is actually born out of direct messages between me and Nicolas. And he said, let's have a webinar because we were discussing precisely these topics. And obviously I said yes that time. But yeah, that's where the movement comes from for me, because there are lots of conversations going on there. And Twitter, while it's great and it enables these conversations, you're not going to scroll down to last year's conversation, So somewhere where we could keep those conversations, a webinar or a podcast, that's it.
Yeah, and Kostia, how about you? How's your experience with Twitter been like?
Well, generally, I think my relations with Twitter are a little ambivalent, because on the one hand, it's full with amazingly smart and funny people with whom I really like to engage. And and I fully agree with Başak. The webinar was essentially born from Twitter. It was a Twitter event because I think that even when it was live, actually someone tweeted, the Twitter becomes so empty, everyone must be on the webinar. So that was really a funny thing to read. But on the other hand, as any other social media, Twitter can be quite exhausting, and it can be quite damaging for one's mental health, right? Because as in any social media, you observe other people being smart, successful, and witty, and you kind of start to doubt whether you're good enough, and so on. So Twitter is very anxiety inducing sometimes. But from a professional and academic perspective, it's an amazing place. And I think it's interesting that it's actually Twitter that kind of took that niche, not some other social media platform. Like, I can hardly imagine like something like this happening on Facebook, for instance.
I can't.
Or obviously not on Instagram, right? Because Instagram is is a visual medium rather than textual. So yeah, it's Twitter is a small, relatively small social media platform, but for academics, I think it's what's the best, what works the best.
Right.
Yeah, and this podcast is obviously, well, primarily distributed on Twitter, right, through our accounts, and through the friends whom we have on Twitter. So that's our main platform for promotion, of course, and so far it works brilliantly. I mean,
And we are not paying our friends to do this. Like,
no.
we didn't ask them. Okay.
And we don't have promoted
you
tweets
can
yet.
at a later stage when you are rich and famous, you know, with your, the podcast, how the way it's doing right now, I wouldn't be surprised, if it becomes the most popular international podcast out there. Yeah.
I think the competition is really,
There's not a lot of not a lot of competition. Most of the podcasts that existed on international law were, old white scholars lecturing on something, and it was mostly lecture or seminars which were converted into a podcast. So even if you look now, there are very few conversational podcasts out there on international law, which makes your entry right now. It's very unique in that way, and it's and I think it looks very promising. I wish you guys all the best as we move to the end. This is something that I like to ask all young scholars and emerging international lawyers. What have been some of the key challenges that you have faced trying to carve a path in international law as an academic, as a scholar, and what advice would you have for young students, undergrads or LLM students who want to pursue a PhD? Perhaps Başak, you can go first, and then Kostia.
What has been a challenge? My passport. My nationality is not the best for visa situations, so that's definitely a challenge. I am living abroad, so not where my family is. Being alone is a challenge. You really need for a PhD, I think you really need a support system, and that's not easy. Other than that, I think, sorry, what was the second part of the question? My advice, to the even younger ones. It's really difficult to give advice because I don't feel entitled to give out advice, as I have not yet made it.
But you're still living through the experience, so you know what it's like. You know what's the reality.
So I'll phrase this in the sense: what would I tell myself a couple of years ago?
Yeah,
I think
that's.
I think that will help me more answering this question. I think I tell myself to not try to do everything at the same time, like be more selective about the conferences you apply to. For example, I would just try to answer every call for papers there was. That was slightly interesting for my topic. I think I should have been much more selective because it's at the end of the day a waste of time if you're not getting in, obviously, but also even if you're getting in, I think so. My dissertation is not in the French system. We don't have articles that become a PhD, so I should be focused on writing this huge book. And I think everything that I have done should have been in that on that path. That's, I think, the biggest advice. So learning to say no somehow to opportunities.
Right. Great. That's very insightful. In Kostia?
Yeah. What's been a challenge? I think every young scholar is facing a challenge of I don't know, finding evidences that never work, by the way, of thinking of oneself as worthy. Right? So we always kind of look for those external confirmations, thinking that they would make us feel better. And they never do, because it's not a problem of external confirmations. It's about like how you internally assess yourself and how you think of yourself. I think that's been a challenge, and it remains a challenge actually. So it I think it will forever stay a challenge for me at least. And yeah, it's not very easy to deal with it, because in today's world, when you're open up to this flow of achievements of other people, to this flow of amazing ideas out there that you see and you're like, this is so brilliant, I will never be able to think of something like that in my life. Yeah, it's very difficult to kind of stay sane and stay cool minded about it. Yeah. So yeah, that's probably been the biggest challenge for me. And yeah, I think my advice, I fully agree with Başak. I don't feel really entitled to give up any advices, because I mean, yeah, who would advise something to me? I'd like I'd like to hear from someone else. But what I could tell is, I don't know, just move on. I mean, yeah, the best thing is not to get stuck, I think. When you're stuck, that's the worst feeling out there. When you're stuck and you can't really overcome the block that you're having. So identifying that block and either bypassing it or trying to break it with a hammer is the best thing to do. Because I've had that myself. I've kind of, in my PhD, I had almost a year when I didn't really write anything. And well, that was difficult, but that also felt very, very bad. But when that period was over, I actually realized that it was quite conducive to my research, because it gave me some space to think and to read and to, I don't know, reflect on things without any rush. So yeah, I think that is a little messy, but that's what I think.
No, thank you. That's thank you both for sharing those personal stories. I think it would be very helpful for people who are in a similar position as you, or perhaps who are aiming to be future PhD scholars. It's good to hear from people who are actually living the experience and who have been through the highs and lows. And if you guys have imposter syndrome, then it's that means that everybody can have it. But thank you. I think our internet is my internet is giving up on me in terms of the synchronization of the videos. Thank you so much, guys, for being on the podcast. It was absolutely wonderful to have both of you. At the end, if you guys want to share your own Twitter handles and where one can listen to Borderline Jurisprudence, what is their Twitter handle, where it's published, yeah, and what's the weekly schedule like, if there is any.
So my Twitter handle is Etkin Başak, and you can find Borderline Jurisprudence on Twitter at Borderline Juris. Kostia?
Yeah, I'm checking my Twitter handle. It's C_Gorobets. Yeah, I always forget about.
I know
I always forget
it.
it.
I could have told it.
Oh, you see, yeah, because you rarely kind of mention yourself, right, in a tweet, but you do mention other people. Yeah, and yeah, of course, subscribe to Borderline Jurisprudence. We are having a lot of episodes coming, and we hope you will enjoy them.
Yeah, for the moment we're on Anchor and Spotify and a couple other
I saw that you guys introduced
platforms.
more platforms today.
Just happened today, so I don't know them by heart either. Let me see. So we're available on Anchor, Spotify, that's for sure, Breaker, Pocket Casts, Radio Public. Yeah.
Great. So you guys.
And yeah, we're also coming, of course, to other platforms such as Apple Podcasts, Google Podcast, and so on.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you, for coming on the podcast again.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. So yeah, I'll see you in the next episode. And take care, guys. Bye.